My name is Sam Afra, and I'm the chairperson of the Ethnic Communities Council of Victoria. And on behalf of the ECCV, I would like to thank you all for joining us tonight here at the Wheelers Centre for this special evening. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land upon which we stand, the Wurundjeri people, and pay tribute to the elders past and present. I'd also like to say how pleased the ECCV is to have been able to establish this important memorial event that we hope will become a key feature of the Wheelers Centre's annual calendar. I'll take this opportunity to thank former state government for providing necessary funding to establish this series of lectures. Of course, we are also gratified to have attracted a speaker such as Tim Costello's caliber to deliver the first lecture, and to have many representatives of Walter Lippmann's family here tonight to join former Prime Minister Malcolm Fraser to officially launch this lecture series. And I think the ECCV, we got more than what we hoped for. So I thank you, the audience who have come along tonight. I share your feeling about the cold night, but it's a Melbourne winter, and it's not bad tonight. I should also like to take a quick moment to tell you why the Ethnic Communities Council of Victoria has organized these lectures in Walter Lippmann's honor. Some of you may already know that Walter Lippmann was ECCV's first chairperson, but his influence upon our organization and the broader Victorian multicultural community extends much further than that. He was a vigorous campaigner for the rights of community groups at the grassroots level, to be given a fair hearing on the issue that affected their lives. In short, he was a champion of multiculturalism. He was a champion of the community. Whether it was in his capacity as ECCV chairperson or as the president of the Victorian Council of Social Services or Jewish Welfare and Relief Society, Walter's knowledge, empathy and dedication to the cause was legendary, and was equally on show during meetings with local councillors or ministers or premiers or the Prime Minister of the day for greater recognition and representation for the voiceless and underprivileged. It was that same passion that continues to inspire those, like myself, who have followed in his footsteps. So what better way to honor that legacy than by attaching his name to an annual lecture which gives a voice to one of his strongest passions, multiculturalism. I believe in faith, and faith is not about religion, it's about what you believe in. Walter's passion and faith was about helping the community, and he didn't care which community. For me to speak in his memory, that's given me a great privilege. And as the chairperson of the ECCV today, I'm not sure if in 20 or 30 years someone will speak about me. And I'm not comparing myself with Walter, because I won't be even near to scratch to what his contribution to the community. But I think the faith will stay, that we ask mainstream to make sure that migrants and refugees given a fair go in the country we call in the books Australia, but in our hearts we call home. On that note, I welcome you all once again and hope you enjoy the evening. Thank you all.
Thank you very much indeed, Sam. Our next speaker is Matthew Albert, who's representing the family of Walter Lippmann. I know that there are a considerable number of family members here tonight who I expect are feeling happy and proud that their family member is being honoured in this way. Would members of the family mind identifying themselves, just so we can get a sense? Put up your hand or stand up for a moment. Come on, I know you're there. There's another one. That's great. Matthew is Walter's grandson. He's also a barrister with a master's from Oxford. He's a lecturer in public law, a former Young Victorian of the Year, and he's worked for UNHCR in Nairobi and Kenya. But that's not all. Matthew is also the co-founder of the Sudanese Australian Integrated Learning Program, which supports the educational aspirations of the Sudanese community in Australia. Matthew is going to remind us of the wonderful legacy left by his grandfather. Matthew.
It is a great and a unique pleasure for my family and I to be here this evening. 17 years after his passing, it is a particular thrill for us to be marking our father, grandfather and uncle's life in this way. We express our sincere gratitude to you, Sam and Ross, and to your team at the ECCV for all the work that you've put in to make this evening possible, and such an incredible success, if only by numbers. And more especially for ensuring that Walter's passion for and contribution to Australian multiculturalism is marked so publicly. Walter Lippmann was and remains to me OPAR. OPAR because despite being made to flee his homeland, Germany, this is what his 4 grandchildren chose to call him. My memory of OPAR is, of course, from the perspective of a child. I remember him hopping my younger sibling and my cousins on his knee to German verse. I remember playing table tennis against him at our grandparents' holiday house at Safety Beach, at which he would always win, despite often playing left-handed to try and help us. I remember also his role, revelling in the role of being a host to people whose only defining characteristics from my point of view was that they were large, they were old and they were noisy. Of course, with hindsight, I now see what an extraordinary privilege it was to grow up with social and political discussion between ministers and senators, politicians of both hues, judges and community leaders, all of whom knew our OPAR as a friend. But my abiding memory of our OPAR was that he was constantly doing multiple things. We would play cards after school at their house. He would usually put his cards down immediately after having his go, have the dictaphone in one hand into which he would be dictating, have a pen in the other by which he was making notes. He would have one ear firmly on the radio, which was inevitably on, and when the phone call rang, always for him, he would be giving media comment or providing counsel to politicians or prime ministers who were seeking it at the time. And I've often thought how much it is that he would like modern forms of communication. Our OPAR was among the most persuasive proponents of multiculturalism in Australia in his time. He was persuasive both in words and advocacy, and in the way that he chose to live his life, a life dominated by public service. In this way, his life was not only committed to promoting intercultural harmony and understanding, but was also a demonstration of the benefits to Australia of bringing talented and committed people to join us. Walter had enormous energy and drive and a great vision for his refuge, Australia. He fought against racism and he fought for equal opportunity. He did so in the name of giving those who could contribute the best chance to have their part in building Australia. The corollary of this is, of course, that the wider Australian community would support multiculturalism if they could see that philoxenia, or offering shelter and taking care of a foreigner, made us a strong and cohesive society. Opar argued long and hard and effectively in favour of an open, multicultural Australia. And while many others did the same in his time and since, I, for one, miss his voice in the fallacy-ridden debates that we too often endure about multicultural issues in these times. He was also the epitome of what a multicultural Australia might gain. As a refugee and a migrant from war-torn Europe, Walter managed to build his light-fitting importation business in South Melbourne while raising a family and contributing to any number of ethnic and Jewish community organisations at the same time. This surely is the kind of person we dream of bringing into Australia. As I've grown up, I've sought more and more to understand our Opar's philosophy. Much to my frustration, his contribution was more in the form of advocacy and lobbying than in writing. Unlike our grandmother, who left us many books on Indigenous Australia from which we can garner her views, Opar left but a few articles. It seems especially fitting, therefore, that he be remembered not with a festschrift or a collection of essays, but with an oration, the purpose of which is to contribute to a conversation that he would have enjoyed and contributed to himself with enormous enthusiasm. I hope that I've inherited many things from my Opar, but I am certain that I've inherited two. The first is his hairline. I notice my only male cousin is not laughing. And the second is perhaps my most prized possession. It's a watch that was gifted to me by my Opar when he was terminally ill. The watch's poignancy tonight is twofold. Firstly, for a person who at one point had to leave his worldly possessions in order to seek haven in Australia, this was his last possession. And secondly, inscribed on its back is a message, and it records that it was a gift from the Ethnic Communities Council. He was so thrilled by it, and he kept it with him until the end of his life. Our only sadness this evening is that Opar is not here to enjoy the occasion. Excuse me. He loved crowds, especially those as engaged and as diverse as this one almost certainly is. He also believed passionately in what the ECCV did and what it stood for. His loss is huge, but so is his legacy. If he were here tonight, my Opar would be sitting in the front row there, quietly chuffed that he was again a catalyst for healthy debate about multiculturalism in Australia. He would be wearing the watch, and he would be keeping one eye on it. And he would be listening to your speech, Tim, with a critical ear, while at the same time, and with all possible discretion, responding to emails and texts. Thank you all sincerely for honouring with your presence here this evening, our father, our grandfather and our uncle, and his contribution. Thank you.
Now, to officially launch the Walter Lippmann Memorial Lecture Series as an ongoing event on the public calendar in Melbourne, I call upon one of Australia's 100 national living treasures, one of our most respected elder statesmen, or is that statesperson these days? I'm quite sure. And certainly one of Melbourne's most cherished sons. Malcolm Fraser is truly one of those people for whom it does not require any real introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Malcolm Fraser.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I pay tribute to the traditional owners, custodians of the land on which we stand and sit, members of Walter Lippmann's family, ladies and gentlemen. It's a very real honour to be asked to launch this lecture series. I think the timing of the launch is all the more relevant and all the more pertinent. Matthew Albert said that he missed his voice today. Well, I think many people miss his voice today because he would find that he's confronting a different Australia from that which he lived in the post-war years. There was a great self-denying ordinance which endured from the time Arthur Cornwall began the migration program till Jerry Hand established razor wire detention centres, or maybe a year or two before that, till the late 80s. And that self-denying ordinance was that politicians in Canberra would not seek votes by playing with the lives of the most vulnerable. They would not seek votes by using race or religion to try and gain a political advantage. There was a general recognition that Australia needed to build, we needed to attract people from many parts of the world if this country was to be defensible, not only defensible in a physical sense, but defensible, if you like, in a moral and ethical sense, because this country is endowed with massive natural resources, which we don't always use well, but to justify ownership of those resources, we needed to share them with more than 7 million people, and putting it bluntly, we need to share them with more than 20 million people by a very long way. So Walter Lippmann's voice today, in an environment where the political debate out of Canberra on the subject of refugees or migration has become thoroughly toxic, thoroughly demeaning and totally contemptuous of Australians, of people like you and I hope people like me, because they are believing that they will win votes if they appeal to the worst of our natures rather than by appealing to the best of our natures. And what does that say of the politicians who use such devices and use such tactics? SBS should be congratulated on the programs they run over the last week or two and concluded last night. It's part of why they were established. I hope a future Liberal Party agenda wouldn't be to save money by amalgamating SBS with ABC, but I would not put it out of bounds. I think we need to understand that we cannot just go along and accept that the land to which so many people have come in the years since the war will continue with that open and compassion and multicultural view and value. We've had politicians wanting to abolish the word, write it out of language. There's a bit of a swing back, the word's put back, but the policies are really the same as the policies of the last three governments. There have been two Labour governments. They're about the same in relation to refugees. People overseas notice these debates. They notice, they wonder, has Australia really changed from the Australia up to and for some years after the Second World War, where the White Australia policy was the official policy of both major parties? And it was destroyed little by little and by agreement between the political parties. And neither the Labour Party nor the Liberal Party sought to gain political marks by saying, you're breaching the White Australia policy. The biggest breach was when the Menzies government signed the Refugee Convention in 1954. That signature spelt the death knell of the White Australia policy, certainly over time. But that signature, that ratification, was totally inconsistent with the White Australia policy. Now, the Australia to which so many hundreds of thousands, indeed millions, have come in the post-war years, including hundreds of thousands from Asia, many of them would not have been able to come in today's Australia because people would have played politics with their arrival. And the world would have, or the attitude in the public mind would have been turned toxic as a consequence of a demeaning political debate out of Canberra. And when are we going to send a message to people who participate in this kind of debate, create it and promote it? Look, it was promoted by a government that was going to lose an election. How can we win? How can we win? Put a fully armed squad of troops onto the Tampa. That went round the world. I was at the Kennedy School shortly afterwards for an event, and the 18 or 20 Australian students there said, can we have a private meeting? It won't take long, we've just got a question. The question was simply, how long do we have to pretend we are not Australian? Do not think that people outside Australia do not notice these debates. And they wonder whether we've returned to the days of Sir Thomas White, somebody probably most of you have never heard of, a not particularly significant minister in the late 1930s. Minister for Trade and Customs in the Australian government in 1938, attended a meeting in Avion. 31 countries were present. The purpose of the meeting was to try and work out some solution to the numbers of Jews then fleeing Nazi Germany, as it was becoming increasingly known of the policies and the terror being created by that Nazi regime. During the course of the discussion at the conference, Sir Thomas White said, in the name of Australia, under the circumstances, Australia cannot do more, for it will be appreciated that in a young country, manpower from the source from which most of its citizens have come is preferred, while undue privileges cannot be given to one particular class of non-British subject without injustice to others. It will no doubt be appreciated also that as we have no real racial problems, we are not desirous of importing one by encouraging any scheme of large-scale migration. We are not desirous of importing one. Well, people do remember those words. You can Google them very quickly, very easily. Many Australians at the time were ashamed of such views. But they were the views, that was the official policy of Australia, of both parties, Labour and Liberal, or Liberal Party was called something else then, but the same attitudes. It was the official policy of both parties in the 40s and in the 50s, and it wasn't until the 60s when really there started to be public acknowledgement that the policy was dead. But if you listen to the debates today, and what leading politicians say about refugees, people who overwhelmingly are shown by their numbers and by the decisions made that they are genuine refugees fleeing terror, death, destruction, prison, torture in their land of birth, their land of origin. We need all to work for the Australia that made the Great Migration possible, to see that it goes on, and to see that because of our attitudes and our views and our advocacy, that politicians who participate in this kind of debate stand condemned in the public eye in Australia. If there's any one reason why I left the Liberal Party, it's this reason. But I've had people coming to me who were refugees from Indochina and came here as boat people, intensely interested in politics. They would not join either party because they cannot distinguish the difference between the parties in today's world. And so it is Walter Lippmann's voice is missed. We need people like him, but it's a different world. We've got a struggle ahead of us. I thought the battle against discrimination, against racism, fear of the unknown was over and won when multiculturalism was fully accepted. I now know that each generation has to win that battle for itself, because you only need one or two people prepared to use this basely for political purposes, to again arouse fears of the unknown. And there's that old saying, for evil to prevail, it is only necessary for good people to do nothing. I happen to believe that the overwhelming majority of Australians are good people. So let's all work and support the values for which Walter Lippmann fought and lived his entire life.
Thank you, Mr. Fraser. The Ethnic Communities Council are very honoured that Tim Costello agreed to deliver the inaugural Walter Lippmann Memorial Lecture. Tim is the CEO of World Vision Australia and has long been the voice of social conscience for many Australians, having led debates on issues as diverse as gambling, urban poverty, homelessness, reconciliation and substance abuse. Tim studied law and education at Monash, followed by theology in Switzerland, and gained a master's in theology back in Melbourne. He's been a Baptist minister in St Kilda and in the city at Collins Street Baptist Church, and as we all know, Tim has served the local community in many, many ways, including for a period as Mayor of St Kilda. He founded Urban Seed, a not-for-profit Christian outreach service for the urban poor, and in 2004 Tim was named the Victorian of the Year. I'm sure you were young enough to have won that award as well, Tim, at the time. We'll go back and check those records, shall we? In June of 2005 he was made an Officer of the Order of Australia. Tim is also currently chairperson of several key advisory councils, including the Community Council of Australia, a peak body for the not-for-profit sector. But perhaps not everyone here will know that Tim is also one of Australia's 100 National Living Treasures, along with Mr. Fraser. Tonight, Tim will deliver an address titled Piecing Australia Together, the Paradox of Cultural Diversity in an Evolving Nation. Tim, please come to the lecture.
Well, thank you for that introduction. It's pretty much as I wrote it, really. Let me also acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, the Wurundjeri, and pay my respect to their elders past and present. And I'd also like to, on your behalf, thank the former speakers from Walter's family and Malcolm Fraser for their very passionate words. I think we've all been deeply moved, and with Malcolm Fraser feeling a strong call to arms. Like Malcolm, I think I'm terribly embarrassed about this being one of Australia's 100 national living treasures. I don't know where you got that. I don't put it on any biography or... Apparently, some papers did a survey asking Australia, this is back in, I think, 1998, to nominate their 100 national living treasures, and I got rung up and told I was on the list, and I laughed. I thought it was ridiculous. They said, no, you've got to come to Sydney. We're going to present you to the public, and there's going to be a dinner. It was, in fact, a fundraiser for the National Trust. I should say I never saw the survey in the papers, nor have I actually ever met anyone who voted. But who am I to distrust the press? The fundraiser was when we got there and were introduced by the then Prime Minister John Howard. We were to go to an allocated table, and people, we only discovered then, had paid $1,500 a ticket to sit at table with one of Australia's 100 national living treasures, not knowing who they would be sitting with. I was there hoping to meet Don Bradman and some of these other people who are... And then we fanned out to our tables, and words fail me in describing the looks on people's faces as they realised they'd paid $1,500 to have dinner with me. There they were, desperately hoping it might be Kylie Minogue, or if not Kylie, at least Ray Martin, and they got me. So you can see why I've always placed that honour in its particular context. So tonight I think it's a very important inaugural lecture, and I'm humbled and honoured to be the first person to give this lecture in honour of Walter Lippmann. As you've already heard, he was instrumental in the foundation of the Ethnic Communities Council of Victoria. His influence cannot be overstated. Walter Lippmann's own life experience, and we've heard a bit of that as a Jewish refugee, was combined with a powerful capacity to envisage and create a better future for others. He lived out his mission through his work with the Jewish community, through the welfare sector, through his extraordinary genius as an advocate, as a networker, and as a powerful inspiration to others in putting multiculturalism at the heart of Australian attitudes and policy. I think he brilliantly understood from the outset the need for ethnic communities in Australia not only to participate in the outward forms of citizenship, but to be directly connected to the political process. He made that visible and that important. So he recognised that through the Council, leaders of communities could develop experience in lobbying and policy making, and thereby improve their access to policy and their impact on policy. He realised that the embrace of cultural diversity meant finding a way to produce engagement and dialogue between communities and between communities and the institutions of government. That was the way to progress a society. It was the way to create a cohesive and creative society. So Walter Lippmann and his associates at the ECCV knew that this involved developing close bonds with both sides of politics. He was an astute advocate. Although one sometimes hears crude references to a multicultural industry somehow tied to the Labor Party, the evidence in fact shows that the ECCV's influence has not depended on which party was in government. Indeed, it reached an especially significant high level of collaboration with Malcolm Fraser's government. Some of the early activists associated with the ECCV did in fact have very strong links to the Liberal Party. Many others had risen through the trade union movement, through churches, religious groups, community welfare and cultural organisations, a very broad base. They also targeted local government as an important vehicle for increased participation. So this inaugural lecture is recognising the breadth and diversity of this experience and just how important it is to mark it. Through ECCV and similar organisations around Australia, many that have subsequently formed, Australia's multicultural communities entered not just into citizenship, but into full participation in civil society. That meant being part of a political discourse. It meant negotiating shifting sands of public mood and government attitudes, joining in a relationship with other players, including government. Relationships that we now know, thanks to the legacy, were cooperative and fruitful, but always also charged with creative tensions. Well, in locating cultural diversity in Australia's political discourse, and Malcolm Fraser has given us a wonderful introduction, one of the dangers inherent in discussing cultural diversity is the confusion, the conflation with discussion of immigration policy in general, population policy, which has been on the agenda, and with the discussion, if that's the word, for what's a rancorous and polarised debate, of the issue surrounding refugees and asylum seekers. I think in part this is because we have constructed a reactionary political story or narrative, which has conflated fear of the outsider with fear of change. At some stages of its history, Australia has tended towards fear. Malcolm's already reminded us a bit of this. The early 19th and 20th century saw fear of invasion that sprang from the fear of being an isolated outpost of British civilisation in Asia and the Pacific. The White Australia policy, the first parliamentary acts of the first federal parliament, the Immigration Restriction Act, etc., set up the architecture, a geopolitical fear with a social anxiety centred on race, a defining keystone of what it meant to be Australian. Fear ran through now almost forgotten sectarianism, Catholic and Protestant, that blighted Australian society for a century or more, and the uncertain and sometimes ambiguous response to successive waves of immigration have been imbued with the demons of fear. Fear of the unknown, the unfamiliar, anxiety about what the future will mean. So, even today, when many Australians contemplate issues like population, what might it mean if the so-called big Australia were to come to pass? They're conflated, of course, with issues of migration and refugees, and beyond that, what does diversity mean? We shouldn't be surprised that in some quarters, worry, fear, anxiety, resentment and anger are the fruit of this conflation of immigration, of big population, of refugees and asylum seekers. So tonight I want to focus particularly on cultural diversity. What does it mean? What does it mean within the context of the Australian story? A story which we have to acknowledge has fear, and White Australia also as a dominant shadow that still casts its big shadow over us. Well, let me just say a few words about population and the refugee issue before moving on to the meaning of cultural diversity. When we think about population, it's quite natural that Australians are interested in how many people live here and where they live. Fast population growth certainly does create challenges in terms of urban infrastructure, housing and services. It's especially tough for revenue-challenged state governments to keep up with the pace of growth. We know we need to intensify concentration in cities where services and infrastructure exist rather than the urban sprawl continuing. It's an ongoing debate between the proponents of a big Australia and those who desperately want growth slowed, or even to see the population capped or reduced. So just a few weeks ago we saw the bookends in this debate. Dick Smith and Bernard Salt simultaneously publishing books advocating the two poles of this debate. I think we need to exercise caution when thinking about how much any political policy fix can determine the long-term outcomes here, especially when it comes to how they think about immigration and the role it plays in the population story, the big or small Australia. You only have to take a long view of the rises and falls in immigration to Australia, particularly since the Second World War, to see very clearly that shifting political policy levers has negligible, at best modest, impact over long-term trends in population. The lowest point in terms of numbers was during the Whitlam government. It was a response to economic downturn and the beginning of a structural shift in the Australian economy. Among the highest intakes of population and immigration, population growth and immigration growth, have been those of the past several years. Again, primarily a response to economic conditions as the resources boom and the attendant economic development created a huge appetite and demand for more workers. Now, with the resources boom still going, but the emergence of a two-speed economy, where there isn't demand in tourism and manufacturing and lots of other areas, so we have this extraordinary boom and fantastic sense of economic indicators, and yet in so many other parts of the nation the feeling we are still in recession, a very dramatic two-speed economy, immigration has dropped off. My point's very simple. Immigration has long been central to the Australian story. It's going to be central long into the future. And what determines it is our economic conditions. People will come to Australia if the opportunities exist, and Australia will demand that they come. Governments can try and dial down the intake in response to a short-term political demand, a political fix. But once labour and skill shortages re-emerge, the pressure to dial up politically will be irresistible. So it's my concern that we understand that immigration and immigrants are not the cause of our congestion, are not the problem, should not be blamed for any or all of our social and environmental problems. Sure, ask the question about Australia's carrying capacity from an environmental point of view, but it's not just a question of how many people. It's just as much a question of how we build our cities, with what density. Can we afford the urban quarter-acre sprawl and dream? It's a question of how we manage our consumption, how we organise our housing, transport, employment and manage our food supply, our energy and our water resources, not just immigration numbers. So let's not confuse these issues with the question of how many Australians there should be and who should and shouldn't be let into the club. Refugees. I think it's a terrible shame, and Malcolm has spoken passionately and eloquently about this, that for more than a decade we have been at a terrible political impasse on the subject of how Australia deals with refugees and asylum seekers. Now, I'm not suggesting that the area isn't fraught with political and practical difficulties, but I think part of the reason we've become stuck is precisely because we have focused on the political and not on the practical. And when I say political, I'm referring to a very narrow, domestic, partisan, introverted aspect of Australian politics, and I can't articulate it any better than Malcolm Fraser did. The Holy Grail, which the political elite all know, post the Tampa, where it was a totally disastrous electoral situation for the Howard government that turned around amazingly, was you play the refugee card and you can win elections. That now is the Holy Grail. At a certain point in the unfolding of this story, we seem to have lost sight of the real heart of the issue, addressing the conflict and the poverty that are the main causes of population movements, refugee movements. And that's why the SBS series was just so profound. Go back to where you've come from. It actually showed conflict and poverty and desperation in source countries is, in fact, the great propeller. That's why there are millions in camps around the world. And I might say with that program, I watched it over 3 nights, well actually over one night, I had to tape it, I was out. And the first 2 nights I was raging with 7 out of the 8 people who were totally unsympathetic to refugees, some openly racist. We don't like black people, we don't like the colour. Trying in my head to say with Raquel, well, she's only 21, she left school at 15, she was taught these attitudes by her father, she's never worked, she hasn't had the exposure I have had, don't judge too quickly. But feeling rage. The power of that psychological journey, though, of taking people to see face to face, real people, genuine, loving, compassionate people in terrible situations, and seeing the psychological breakthrough of, wow, I get it. These people aren't just bad. These people are just like me. They have the same hopes and dreams. To see that psychological change, I have to admit I had tears running down my face. As a piece of television, I just found it extraordinary. I know it had the sort of cute MasterChef style, you know, the next assignment if you accept it. But it actually worked. It worked. And for 800,000 Australians to watch SBS, for them to tweet, that power was just completely extraordinary. Well, telling those stories, I think, has the opportunity to say, can we understand the real reasons for people movement and refugees? And in that light, then think intelligently about regional frameworks. That would give Australia space to implement more generous refugee policies and humane policies without raising exaggerated fears about securities, about borders. Isn't it interesting? All the shows on TV are about, you know, border patrol and sea patrol. It's quite extraordinary just what has percolated into our psyche. And then to capitalise on the opportunities that refugees, like all other newcomers before them, have given to build this healthy and vibrant society. That point should never be overlooked. So much of the debate about refugees is premised on the assumption they are a burden. They are a problem. They should go back to where they came from. Yet aren't we also given to claiming newcomers as our very own when they do well? I notice there's someone playing a match at Wimbledon tonight whose father coach has a very heavy accent. I haven't heard anyone saying, well, that's not a genuine Australian. It is fascinating to me that when it comes to refugees, I don't think Sir Gustav Nossel was a burden or a problem to Australia. I don't think Frank Lowy was. When I hear Les Murray talking about soccer, oh, I'm sorry, I guess you call it football, or when I hear that North Melbourne have signed Magic Door, a refugee from Sudan, or when I see Melbourne's latest Catholic bishop, a Vietnamese boat person, that these are burdens. It suggests potential for what has always been the great achievement of people coming to Australia and making us richer in every way that refugees do. The critical problem is that fear is an irresistibly attractive political tool in partisan debates. And so when respected leaders like Malcolm Fraser or experienced public servants like John Menadue and Bill Farmer suggest we need a more humane, coherent and consistent policy, one that's less politically charged, I normally notice what follows those comments is a deafening political silence. But they're right. They are absolutely right. Well, I won't expand much more on this because I want to get to the main point of this talk. And I'll simply leave you with we need less heat, more light on these issues, that politicians and voters alike must unlearn the lesson of the Tampa in 2001. The idea that refugees are a legitimate political football. An issue that you can turn into an election loss or win through Australians' fearful response. The real threat to our security is not on the water, it's in our own minds. It's not refugees that make us uneasy, it's the crippling emotion of fear. But I remain an optimist about Australia and about its future. I, like Malcolm, still believe we'll eventually see hope and confidence triumph over fear. Because I do believe we are resourceful, resilient and determined, and we have the resources and the intelligence to push our way through this very, very black time. Piecing Australia together. To describe Australia as culturally diverse may seem to be stating the obvious. But it's not simply a descriptive statement of, yes, diverse birthplaces and ethnic heritage of Australia's people. Living with diversity, working through its challenges and complications, constantly co-creating new stories and new possibilities with people who are different from ourselves is fundamental to Australia's narrative. It's an essential part of Australia's story. It's a bit on Australia Day we should be when we have our endless soul searching as to what a real Australian is over the barbecue. This is the bit that needs to be told over and over again. It's important that we understand the distinctiveness of Australia's multicultural journey, even with the shadows and the sinister past. Even while we consider that the fact that cultural diversity is the DNA of our experience, and, for that matter, of most countries and countries in the 21st century, but particularly of us. And in understanding and embracing that, yep, there are complexities, predicaments and possibilities, but Australian multiculturalism must be understood on its own terms. It's fundamental to our story, as an essential ingredient in our story. So I shudder and find it misleading and simplistic to unthinkingly impose the paradigm of the American culture wars on our experience, or the struggle of other European countries to come to terms with the outsider within, and we know many European countries are struggling with that. Don't impose that on the Australian context. Our story is fundamentally different. This means considering the ways that Australia represents common or universal experience in understanding our own distinctiveness. It's so important to recognise our story here. First, to put it in the global context, we aren't alone in dealing with the change that comes with increased cultural diversity. The whole world is changing. The pace and nature of that change is, of course, driven by globalisation, by the rise of new economic powers, by new media and social technology. More people than ever travel, for more different reasons. Not just the traditional stories of fleeing war and persecution or chasing economic opportunity. Hundreds of thousands of British people live in Spain. Brazil has a Japanese population of over 4 million. When I go to Africa, I'm amazed at the Sino presence. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese living and working in Africa. Perhaps even more surprising is the presence of African faces on the streets of cities in China. And we should not forget that over 1 million Australians now live overseas. So we're not alone. We're not the only country of immigration. We're not just a country of immigration. We have a huge diaspora of our own. And no doubt presenting an absorption challenge for countries of residence where Australians live. So here's one part of our cultural diversity. It's part of a global story. That's its global context, but at the same time, it's a fundamental part of our story, to be understood only in Australian terms. How do we reconcile being a cohesive and coherent national community, not just with diversity, but with an evolving understanding of diversity? And how do we accept that this is what has made us great? This is why we are so proud of being Australian. Let me talk about diversity and social cohesion. Social cohesion is often posed by critics of multiculturalism as the rationale for denying the aspirations of cultural diversity. But cohesion in society should not be confused with political passivity or social conservatism or the pressure for every individual and every group in society to conform to some privileged but artificial norm of culture. I don't think it's critical that all refugees know Don Bradman's batting average. Social cohesion, in fact, depends on other factors besides cultural conformity. And if we face challenges in keeping our social fabric intact, we don't have a right to blame that on cultural diversity, which is easily the slippage point. For mine, social cohesion depends on three things. The first is social solidarity. It raises the question of what equality means in today's society. The strength of a community, I believe, has a lot to do with how it treats those of its members who are suffering from disadvantage. This is what social solidarity means. Social exclusion, being marginalised, denied opportunity to take part in the community, for mine is a sign the community has lost its way, has fragmented around social solidarity. An ethos of radical individualism, one that puts competition at the heart of human life, while neglecting our obligations to one another. Our social interdependence is a real danger to the cohesion of a national community, to our social cohesion. In this regard, I do think we need to take care and take lessons from other countries, including the United States. There in the US, the concentration of wealth in the hands of a relative few. The rise of the excluded underclass. The squeezing of the middle class, for mine, are all in evidence. And some of that appears to me to be a danger of emerging in Australia, particularly with this two-speed economy. I sometimes watch Fox News just for, well, I don't know why I watch it. Punishment, sadomasochism, I guess. When Obama brought in a health plan that was to include 50 million Americans, I was just amazed. There was Glenn Beck and Bill O'Reilly saying this plan is worse than Soviet serfdom. It is worse, they said, than Pearl Harbor, a greater disaster than 9/11. I just couldn't believe it. The breakdown in social solidarity. They're just asking for a little piece of the pie that so many other Americans have, even if it's expensive. Homelessness remains a huge issue in Australia. Despite our unprecedented wealth, welfare agencies are again experiencing rising demand for their services. And we are just really now starting to come to terms with the silent, invisible epidemic in mental health. Depression, problem gambling, substance abuse all take their toll. So it's important that these social problems are kept in the front of our minds, that we find social solidarity to address them. I think it's important that ethnic communities, especially those recently arrived, those affected by language barriers, those rebuilding lives after trauma and war, are not permanently consigned to social disadvantage by a social and economic system that generates winners and losers, by the increasing drift apart of a two-speed economy. I think it's fundamentally important for Australia, where the notion of a fair go, the notion of a social laboratory, the first to have, child endowment and pensions, even intervention in market forces with Mr. Justice Higgins' Sunshine Harvester case. And I love the fact that when he intervened setting a family wage, he didn't just work out what it cost then a working man to clothe his family, feed them, pay the rent. He included in that wage the cost of a daily newspaper. Interesting. He said, here in this country, even the worker will participate. And how will he participate if he can't be politically informed? He will only be able to do that if he can afford a newspaper. Yet we know in the two-speed economy, inequality can plummet us, drive us toward that American experience. There's been a lot of discussion, some criticism of the methodology used by Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett in their much discussed book, The Spirit Level, Why Equality Matters. But I think, whatever the discussion on the methodology, their point is still very telling. They compared 23 OECD countries in the proportion of inequality, what the top 10% owns compared to the bottom 20%. They compared 50 states of America on inequality. What they found was the greater the inequality, the more imprisonment, mental illness, the more violence, and people in those countries live shorter lives. It hurts even the rich to live in gated communities with the anxiety of crime. Well, their thesis, I think, is a very important thesis for social solidarity. We know poverty is always relative, and maintaining that is incredibly important. A second element in social cohesion is community. People and ethnic communities know this very well, need a sense of belonging and participation. Ritual, conversation, celebration, ways of sharing their life with others. Over the past decades, many factors have reduced this. We live in distant suburbs. Public interaction happens more and more through media and less face-to-face over the back fence. We travel longer distances to work. We exercise so much more freedom to choose in leisure activity. More dependent on the shopping mall, less on the town centre. More likely to exercise in a gym than join a sporting team. Increasingly free to make private choices about everything from what doctor to where we send our kids to school. Now, I believe in freedom and freedom of choice, but community means rebalancing this individualism with just the incredible importance of connection, conversation, community. It's all very wonderful, and I do it, to retreat into our individual worlds with technology, the iPod, the iPhone, the iPad. I have them all. But notice it's the I in every word. Where is the us? The extraordinary experience I had with 3 kids, all on Facebook, and so as their father, they're adults, I applied to be their friend on Facebook. I was pretty shocked when all 3 rejected me. I couldn't believe this. When I asked why, they said, that's parental stalking, go away. Well, we still have great relationships, but it was an insight into this world and who you choose and who you delete and who's allowed in. Well, a culturally diverse society is critically important. A sense of belonging, a sense of identity, balancing the I with the we. So, brushing up against our neighbours who have maybe a different identity and accent, overcoming some isolation and fear of difference, overcoming of alienation of our surroundings is incredibly important. Thirdly, the basis for social cohesion is also mutual respect. So I've talked about solidarity, community and mutual respect. It's not a soft notion of tolerance or even a hard concept of conformity or obedience. Rather, I mean a notion that everyone in our community is embraced by certain core values and expectations. These values are difficult to define with absolute precision. They're not immutable. They do evolve, they change over time, but their essence is respect. It is the acceptance by each of us that others will exercise their freedoms and their capabilities to act in pursuit of the good life as they themselves see it, as they name it. And with this, the assurance that in so doing, others will also respect our own freedoms and capabilities as we ourselves pursue the good life as we name it. In saying that, mutual respect as a key plank of cultural diversity does not equate with an unlimited licence to act, speak or behave in ways that injure others or truncate their freedoms. It exists within and helps to strengthen the social contract that underpins our common life and our individual welfare. So in public terms, this principle of mutual respect, and we see it at work when we consider civil liberties. our freedoms of speech, association, our right to participate in political processes, the respect for the rule of law. But it's important that this respect is not confused with an enforced cultural conformity. It's necessary that everyone in Australia respects the democratic tradition and the rule of law, but it is not necessary, even if desirable, that we all follow AFL football, that we all understand Australia's test captains, practice a particular religion, conform to norms of dress or language or manners. So let me conclude with a paradox. I like to say that cultural diversity is integral to the Australian story. It is fundamental to the meta-narrative of Australian life. It is the fundamental part of what it means to be Australian. For most of us coming to Australia, or being the children of those who came to Australia, it's all about becoming as well as being. I grew up in Blackburn, where everyone ate meat pies, could stab kick a footy, where the only foreign-sounding name I knew as a kid was Barassi. That sounded a bit foreign to me. My kids grew up in St Kilda. Their best friends were Cambodian kids who waited 8 years with their family in a Thai refugee camp. We called them the Sockers. There were 4 kids: Sockenteer, Socklom, Soccer, and Pauline. Pauline was the only one born in Australia and named after the midwife. And they were Buddhists, and our kids, of course, were Christians, and I just thought about the becoming in my life, the change. It's not just about being, it was about who our kids regarded as their best friends and what our neighbourhood was. So, for all of us in Australia, it's about becoming. We come here with the tradition and heritage, with our own values and aspirations. We don't throw them away lightly. And yet, we don't expect that we're going to remain caught in time. Culture evolves, identity evolves, our horizons extend and expand. So the paradox of cultural diversity is that it is precisely in diversity that we discover cohesiveness. It's precisely in diversity we discover a coherence. It's precisely in diversity that we have a meaningful, evolving identity. And this evolution is the key to the flow of history. If we do not allow a mix of elements, of values, of aspirations in society, then we are doomed to remaining the same forever. Just as some religious traditions would tell us that we need to lose ourselves in order to find ourselves, so each of us can find richness and meaning by joining our sense of identity with that of our neighbours who are different. It's the paradox of a rich, culturally diverse society that allows us to be fully functional within multiple human environments in which we live. Families, workplaces, neighbourhoods, political communities, and what we call the Australian nation. It's in such a society we find our true identity, our sense of purpose in life, not by holding on tightly to what we have been, but by engaging ourselves in the prospect of what we can become. Thank you.